G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with a bit of a funny story to tell yous concerning Chinamen and how long they've been influencing Australian life. And the story begins with steam engines, owing to the fact that when I was a kid, my father was fairly well connected with the start-up of this Land of the Beardies History House and Museum, and he used to spend his weekends hunting down steam engines that had been abandoned out in the Australian bush. So there came a time when he was on the scent of this one, which he'd heard was located under a tree in a paddock out between Tingha and Gilgai. So we proceeded out to my father's mother's ancestral homelands, and we found someone who reckoned they knew where the steam engine was, and we sought directions. So the old bloke given the directions told my father, you set off down that there road and you go about 5 miles and you'll come to an old Chinaman beside the road on your right hand side. The old man nodded at all that, made sense to him. Me, little kid, 6 or 7, made no sense to me at all. Why would there be a Chinaman beside the road between Tingha and Gilgai to tell us where to turn off? Anyway, the old bloke says to my old man, about 300 yards past the Chinaman, there's a gate in the fence, turn off, follow the fence line, turn left when you come to the boundary fence, and there under the tree, you'll find the steam engine. Yeah, thank you very much, my father said. So when we got back in the car, I said to the old man, Dad, that fella must be crazy. He says, why? And I said, why the bloody hell did he think there's going to be a Chinaman standing beside a dirt road in the middle of nowhere to tell you and us where to find a steam engine? And the old man, he just sort of smiled and he said, no, not that sort of a Chinaman, different kind of a Chinaman. He said, the story goes back quite a while. Now at the time, I knew there'd been Chinamen in Glen Innes since the 1880s. And it's still there. Although this is the 1915 edition of their shop. So anyway, when I was 6 or 7 years old, yeah, I'd met Chinamen, I'd seen Chinamen. There were Chinamen running a shop in the main street of Glen Innes. They didn't come from China, but their grandparents and great-grandparents did. So, to get a bit of a handle on the relativity of the dates, here we see the first store in Glen Innes was opened in 1848. Became the nucleus of the town of Glen Innes in 1854. Gold was discovered in Victoria in 1848. In 1857, the old Glen Innes to Grafton Road had been dug by convicts and it was opened, and the purpose of it was to get gold from the Vegetable Creek goldfields northwest of Glen Innes to the wharf at Grafton on the Clarence River. So the old man proceeded to explain about a different kind of Chinaman altogether. When we'd gone a sufficient distance down the correct road, the old man pointed at a thing like this and he said, see that? That's the Chinaman. He said, we've got to turn off to the left, 300 yards past that. And even at bloody 7 years old, as smart as kids are, I could not for the life of me fathom why that is a Chinaman. And the old man's answer was as follows. He said, when the gold played out in Victoria and the miners come north looking for other places with similar sorts of soil. He said, we got a gold rush up here. And with the gold mines come gold miners, and shortly after the European gold miners, there come the Chinese gold miners. And the whole man's story is that before the Chinamen came here, when the English and the Scots and the Welsh, the Irish, when they were trying to load anything heavy onto a wagon or a dray, they used to have to pick it up by hand and grunt and sweat and heave it up over the tailgate. And he said when the Chinamen come here, working in gangs, contract gold miners on the big dredges, whether they were loading timber as fuel for steam engines or timber for pit props or timber to build stuff out of, he said any time they got a job where they had to load anything onto wagons, the very first thing they did was build one of these things, a Chinaman's ramp. And they taught the Europeans about inclined ramps, you know, like Europe never noticed the pyramids apparently. The Chinamen did. So therefore, thus and because, my father was taught by his father and grandfather to call a thing like that a Chinaman, because he was born in 1909 and they dropped the term ramp off the end of Chinaman's ramp. A Chinaman's ramp, at that point in time, it was just a Chinaman. By the time I was a kid in the 60s, 1960s, it was really only the old buggers 50 years older than me who were still calling them Chinamen. And since the bushfires of global warming, most of the old original Chinaman's ramps, they've rotted away and burnt out. Which is not to say that they're fallen out of favour. Now this one, it doesn't use round logs for the vertical wall. These are what you call sleeper backs, cut on a circular saw. I could take you to innumerable Chinaman's ramps that don't have any hard facing on the vertical wall at all. They've just been pushed up there by a bulldozer for one single day or a couple of days worth of work and they've been left there. I can point you to another one that's got green painted roofing iron on its vertical surface and also on the bankment walls. But it's on a farm and this is a lot closer to an original Chinaman's ramp than the one with the metal facing. So that's how long Chinese have been exporting their technology into Australia and teaching us how to do smart shit since the 1850s. Bear in mind, first shop in this town 1854, Glenninnes to Grafton Road was opened in 1857, dug by some of the last convicts that were exported to Australia. That there is a Chinaman's ramp. Let it not be forgot. So lately there's been a bit of comment in Australia about how the Chinese have been bringing their technology to Australia in the form of wind turbines and solar panels on a scale much bigger and much more impressive and much cheaper than Australia would ever be capable of, left to its own devices. And when I say that Chinaman's windmills represents an import of technology on a scale Australians could pretty much never have imagined, this is what I mean. That was one wind farm. That down there, that's one solar farm with another wind farm in the background. The Chinamen have made a very, very large investment in Australia. And the theory is that Gold Wind Australia, which is the company that owns the farm we're looking at, it belongs to Gold Wind China. And Gold Wind China has contracts with the Australian energy distributors, the people who own the poles and the wires in the grid, and the Chinese investors and shareholders expect Australia to be buying electricity for the next 20 or 30 years. That's going to emerge from those windmills and that solar farm and that wind farm over there as well. There's a lot of Chinese money tied up in those wind turbines and those solar panels. Bloody lot of money. Now, apart from windmills and solar panels and Chinaman's ramps, there's other stuff that goes into the Australian-Chinese relationship. During the gold rush, the white Australian miners took exception to the Oriental miners coming to Australia because they worked in teams rather than individuals. They were seen to be more efficient. They were feared because it was thought that Chinese were going to come out here by the thousands, by the millions. They were going to take over all the best goldfields. So Australia began implementing prejudicial policies against the Chinese on a governmental level. On a more fine-grained level, the European miners were in the habit of making midnight raids on the Chinese miners, beating them up, cutting their pigtails off, running them out of town. Just your average European white supremacist religious prejudices. So that was while the Chinese were showing us how to make a Chinaman's ramp. We were cutting their pigtails off and, for example, not permitting them to give evidence in court because they weren't Christians, therefore you couldn't take any notice of their oath. That was in the 1850s to the 1880s. Around here in 1880, they discovered that the black sand on the banks of Vegetable Creek was actually pure crystalline tin. And the gold rush had petered out and gone away, but the tin boom took off. And the Chinese who came to work the tin mines in the 1880s, they took one look at Emerville and they explained to the tin miners how back in China, every man in a village who had a job would make a regular weekly payment to the doctor while they were working. And then if they took sick, they didn't pay the doctor while they were sick, but the doctor had to treat them for free, which was a big incentive for the doctor to give them a really good treatment. So out there at Vegetable Creek, which was then gazetted as the town of Emerville, the tin miners copied the Chinese system, and what became the town of Emerville had the first medical benefits scheme or health insurance system in Australia, taught to us by the Chinamen. But you also had in the 1880s the phenomenon of the British sending a punitive military naval expedition to China in order to attempt to brutally inflict regime change onto the Chinese so they could install a government that would be favourable to the policy of permitting the British to ship in boatloads of opium that they were paying the Indians to grow, and then use the Indian opium to pay for all of the Chinese wooden lacquered boxes and bolts of silk and wonderful manufactured goods that the Europeans wanted to source from China and ship around to Europe and sell at a high profit. That was called the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars. What's it got to do with Australia? Well, the colony of New South Wales sent a contingent of troops and a bloody artillery battalion to help Queen Victoria bombard the Chinese into submission. During the First World War, Chinese labourers dug most of the rear and third echelon trenches in France because the French and the English and the colonial imperial troops, they were too busy fighting to do any digging. Who was it maintained the roads for the First World War? Chinese labourers, just like the Chinese labourers who dug the bloody gold mines. One point there, the Chinese gold miners were only permitted to reprocess the waste heaps that the white gold miners had already been through and thrown aside, and they could make a living out of that because they were more efficient. Before Europe and America and Australia got involved in World War II, we were helping the nationalist Chinese who were simultaneously at war with the Japanese and with the communist Chinese. After the Communist Chinese helped Australia defeat the Japanese Empire, we once again swung in behind the nationalists. For years and years and years, we recognised the Taiwanese government as the government of China. In Korea, Australian soldiers sat up on top of hills and shot down human wave attacks of Chinamen trying to help their North Korean neighbours. In Vietnam, who made the guns for the North Vietnamese? Russians and Chinese. We have a pretty long history, to be honest. Edward Gough Whitlam in about 1973 or 74 was the first Australian Prime Minister to visit China. But Bob Hawke was the Australian Prime Minister who said after Tiananmen Square, anybody who's got a problem with the Chinese government, you can come to Australia, you can live in Australia, you can conduct political campaigns for regime change in China from Australia. There's lots of reasons why the Communist Party of China might have the shits with Australians. And those reasons go back to the 1850s when we were cutting their ancestors' pigtails off because they were teaching us how to use an inclined ramp. So I kind of got a bit ahead of myself with Bob Hawke because, well, it was Mal Fraser who decided to shut down Australia's manufacturing industry. It was John Howard, another Liberal Prime Minister. He decided that Australia was going to become not only a farm and a mine to the world, but we were going to sell Australia to the Chinamen, one boatload at a time. And, well, since Tiananmen Square, since Bob Hawke, China has become a manufacturing powerhouse. It's been selling cheap, bright, shiny landfill to the entire world. A lot of it manufactured from Australian iron ore, a lot of it smelted using Australian metallurgical coal. They also used a lot of thermal coal. They had such a huge population that there were some of them who were rich. There were more rich people in China than there were in Australia, so we started shipping our luxury goods to them. Lobsters, wine, barley for them to make beer, timber, all shipped off to China. For about the past 20 years, 60% of everything that Australia exports, it goes to China. After an interlude for the tourists. Okay, so where was I? Johnny Howard decided to sell Australia to the Chinamen, one boatload at a time. 25 years we've been doing that. We sell them LP gas at 3 cents a litre. We sell them thermal coal, we sell them metallurgical coal, we sell them iron ore, we sell them bauxite, plus luxury goods. Well, last year, maybe a year and a half ago, the Americans decided that they didn't want a Chinese company called Huawei having anything to do with the next 5th-generation computer hooter machines. And a bloke called Pompeo came out to Australia and he told Australia's government that we are not permitted, because we're in a spy versus spy outfit called the Five Eyes organisation, Australia is not permitted to purchase broadband technology from China, from Huawei. And at that point, when Australia announced that, every Chinese government minister in Beijing told their secretary that we no longer answer the telephone to the Australian government. For a year and a half, our government has been unable to speak to the Chinese government. And then the bat eater's lament virus got loose. And for the first 6 weeks, 2 months, the local medical bureaucrats, administrators around Wuhan were too scared to tell Beijing that they had a big problem. It took a couple of months. But by the time Beijing got the message that there was a novel zoonotic pneumonia virus that was transmissible person to person and it was killing a whole bunch of old people, by the time that news got out, so had the virus. Western tourists and business people going to China had already carried it worldwide. So about 3 or 4 months ago, around about the time the Americans realised that they had completely and utterly made a pig's ear of trying to keep COVID under control, suddenly their president changed his tune from telling everybody what a good job China was doing. Suddenly he was telling everybody that China had unleashed the virus on the world and it was all China's fault that America's economy was collapsing and he was in lockdown, and it was all a big boo-hoo sob issue. And because Australia likes to function as a pet, tame, attack-trained chihuahua that has its leash going all the way back to the Pentagon, Australia's Deputy Minister for Defence, Maurice Payne, she got up and publicly demanded that the United Nations send an investigatory committee into China to find out what the true story was behind the origin of the bat eater's lament virus. And the Chinese had apparently just about had it up to here at that point. They were sick of being treated as subhumans, as Untermensch by these Euro peons, and particularly this mob of bloody Euro peons. The poor white trash of Asia, as Singapore's Prime Minister called us back in the days when Paul Keating had the job of being Australia's Prime Minister. When the poor white trash of Asia started demanding that China be whipped across the foreskin with a wet bootlace for giving everybody else the bat eater's lament virus, that's when the Chinese government started ringing up their importers. And they said to their barley importers, mate, we're not buying any more Australian barley. Chinese government didn't say anything to the Australian government. The Australian exporters rang up the Australian government and said, oh, boo-hoo, sob, the Chinamen want to put 180% tariff on our barley because you fellas gave us an irrigation supplement during the drought, and they say that's a subsidy against World Trade Organization rules. And then they stopped buying meat, processed meat from Australian abattoirs, even though some of these abattoirs are owned by Chinese companies. So there's nothing rational and commercial going on there. Then they decided that Australian timber had bark beetles in it. And then they decided that Australian lobsters had heavy metal poisoning. Well, I'm pretty sure the Tasmanians did, in fact, build a paper mill on Bass Strait, which discharges mercury into the strait, and therefore the lobsters might be a little bit polluted. But have you ever seen any programs documenting the air in China and the water in China and what they drink and breathe? You wouldn't think a bit of mercury in a lobster from Tasmania would be that much of a problem for them. But then they decided that Australian wine, they said that was being dumped in China. The most expensive wine in the Chinese bottle shop comes from Australia, and they're accusing us of dumping. Then they stopped buying thermal coal. There are apparently whole Chinese cities who are going cold. They're not allowed to turn the heater on until it's colder than 3 degrees Celsius because China's not buying Australia's coal. At the moment, we're just waiting for them to stop buying metallurgical coal and iron ore, and then they won't be buying anything from us. They're still not talking to our government. Why is it so? I think they've got the shits. And they've had the shits ever since we were cutting their pigtails off in the 1850s because they were doing a better job of mining Australian gold than were the English immigrant gold miners, and the Welsh, and the Irish, and the Scottish, and the Germans, and the Americans, because we had a flood of people coming here. In the 1850s, sailing ships would tie up to the wharf in Sydney and be stuck there for a year or so because you couldn't get a crew to sail them away again. Everybody jumped ship to go and seek their fortune in the gold mines. And when they got drunk on a Saturday night, they'd go and cut some Chinese pigtails off for the fun of it. Well, chickens are coming home to roost, aren't they? Chickens are coming home to roost. Here we are. We've got all these Chinese windmills all across the landscape. if they succeed in bankrupting our economy, how much electricity are the Australian cities going to buy from the distributors who have contracted to purchase the power from the Chinese wind farms and solar farms? It's an interesting thought, isn't it? If the Australian electricity distribution companies default on their contracts to buy electricity from the Chinese wind farms, how does a Chinaman in Beijing take action to repossess a wind farm in Australia? And if America's lame duck prissy dunce for the next 28 days, if he decides that he wants to actually start something of a shooting match over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, it's not the South American Sea, it's the South China Sea, Australia is pretty much firmly committed to go in there yapping. The whole Australian population is feeling slightly antagonistic towards China because of all this not diplomacy that's been going on, all this refusal to discuss shit and just, no, I don't want to buy that this week, sorry, good luck. Yeah, we know you've structured your whole economy to serve our markets, but we don't want to buy your stuff because you're Australians. Yeah. My personal belief is that if America chooses to lose another Asian war, picks it and loses it against China, Australia's probably going to go along for the ride. When Australia helps America to lose a war to China, we're going to be in the same position that Hungary was after having helped Adolf Hitler try to conquer Moscow. Hungary was a Soviet satellite state for 40 bloody years. This is where Australia is headed with China. We could become a Chinese mining and farming colony. Perhaps Alaska could be seized as war reparations, and Hawaiian Islands could become a holiday resort for ranking Beijing mandarins after the war. If it gets that far, who knows? Global warming, extreme weather, bat eaters lament virus. Perhaps the global vile age will contract and implode in upon itself so fast that nobody has enough energy to be bothered trying to conquer anywhere or repossess any windmills and solar farms. But there you go, and now you know, and that's pretty much the story of Chinamen in Australia. How long they've been here, how long they've been showing us better ways to do stuff, how long they have been contributing Chinese technology to the Australian way of life. And where it's going to go from there, nobody knows. But it's all very interesting to look on and ponder. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. How's that for a fool on the hill video? Ciao.